They don't have labs open in spring break, do they? No.
Everything closes down.
Why would you want to come on spring break?
I know.
That's self-abuse.
It's a sick person.
Okay, today I wanted to talk about typography. Just cover the basics, similar to what I did with regard to scanning and starting a new file, using 72 pixels per inch, for example, if you're going to design for the web, or 300 pixels per inch if you're going to design for print. There's a lot of wiggle room in there, meaning that there are many instances when that's not the case, but when in doubt, that's a good place to get started. So that's what I want to talk about today, is typography. You have really wonderful tools in Photoshop, and the typography tools in particular are really powerful. They can do a lot more than what traditional typesetters were able to do, and in a fraction of the time. So to start with, typography, the actual typeface that I'm using here is Roman, and that's where the first, that is the first modern typeface. It did not have an initial cap. They were all caps. There were no lowercase letters. They were taken from Trajan's column in Rome. They're really exquisite in proportions and elegant, and were used for many, many years. And modern serif typefaces in proportions were derived from this typeface. Now, categories of type. There were basically 5 separate categories. Serif, you can see, like the Roman typeface, the little feet, that's what I call them. Those are serifs. The little flanges that extend from the foot, or could be the top of the, you see the I and R, the E and the S have the little flares. Those are serifs. And they do have a function. They actually enhance readability, legibility. So oftentimes when you're using type for body copy, you're going to want to use serif typeface. It really enhances and helps the readability. That's why when you look at the New York Times, or look at the Los Angeles Times, or most newspapers in print, they use the serif typeface, and they're all pretty basic. I won't say they're basically the same. There are nuances and differences, but fundamentally the same. And they do use them for a purpose, for legibility and readability. However, having said that, when you're designing for the web, because you're only viewing the document at 72 pixels per inch, serif typefaces don't work very well. And that is for the body copy. The little serifs get lost and they break up a little bit due to the low resolution, so they don't work that well. So instead, you use something sans serif, from French, meaning without serifs, that's all. Serif typefaces are more modern. Oftentimes the proportions of the letter forms are different than the early serif typefaces. And being that the proportions are different, you'll see in a moment that there are way more variations of these this group of type is available for you, and it can be a little bit overwhelming at times. Sans serif can be used for a variety of purposes. It can be used for headlines, it can be used for subheads, and it can also be used for body copy as well, just like the serif typefaces. However, in some instances, especially in print, sans serif is hard to read when you have a large block of type. It's just part of it. There are some magazines on the newsstands that do use sans serif typefaces, like People magazine, stuff like that. In order to enhance the readability, though, they open up the leading, the spaces between lines. Okay, so these are the 2 most common typeface categories that are used often. Then there's script, which is based on handwritten or calligraphic forms of writing styles. There's black letter, which is again taken from old manuscripts and handwritten documents. with probably a broad pen where you get the line varied weights. But now they formalized them into actually specific typefaces. And then the last group are decorative, and they can be, it's any kind of type, look and appearance. Okay, you can see that this one that I've used the word decorative, it becomes pretty decorative, but I can't remember the typeface itself. It's kind of cracked or something like that. It has some name ascribed to it that is appropriate. But these can have, in used properly, they'll be once in a lifetime kind of thing. You can say that's the perfect typeface. It conveys meaning that I want in my design, and you'll use it. But typically for script, it's the only time you would use it is maybe for a wedding invitation, especially for copy. In special instances when you're designing magazines or newspapers, or not so much newspapers, but magazines or ads or something like that. You'll use it for a headline, maybe a subhead, but never for body copy. Too much of it is hard to read. Black letter, say, since it's kind of old school, real old school, it is kind of popular among gangs and bikers, things like that. You know, I mean, you see that used a lot. But it really, maybe in a special instance, used for an initial cap to convey kind of an old feeling, or maybe for a headline to convey a specific mood or meaning. This typeface would work well. Again, decorative type, same thing. So you typically only use it for headlines, maybe for subheads, but never for body copy. So even though there are 5 categories, really you can really put these 3 categories in a group of decorative as well these days. Okay, because they're used mostly for headlines and rarely, if ever, used for body copy. It's just way too hard to read when there's a lot of words. Okay, so there's the basic 5 categories. Now, subgroups within those categories, you'll find a family of typeface. They anthropomorphize. What they do is they use people to help you to define different kinds of type. So we had the 5 basic categories. Within those categories, you'll have a family of type. Within the family, there will be specific faces, and then each face is defined by a font. So, for example, I took the sans serif that I had shown you a moment ago, which is Helvetica, classic, in its proportions and appearance, and it's a Swiss, modern typeface, and used it, and so we have the family Helvetica. Well, I mentioned that modern typefaces are proportioned differently. They enable the designer to create wide, variation, broad number of variations of that typeface. And you can see these are not all of them, these are some. You can see that we can start with condensed bold, condensed black. So you need a type that is tall, but you have a lot of letters that have to fit in a very narrow horizontal space. Your condensed type will work lightly, or work well. Then we go to the ultralights, and you have ultralight, ultralight italic, and then a little bit heavier to light, light italic, and then we go to regular, regular italic, bold, bold italic, and then we haven't even covered the extended typefaces. So if you don't have much height, but you want to cover a large, expanse, horizontal expanse, we would have the extended typefaces too. My recommendation is when you're using type that maybe at most you use in the design of a brochure or ad or whatever it is that you're designing, at most maybe you use 2 different type styles. You really only need 1, and then within that, so if you pick Helvetica as the family that you're going to choose, within that, to get variation within your design, for emphasis, you could pick something bold. That's what you would use for your headline, or what you would use for a subhead. And then for the content that's less important, you would probably pick something that's lighter. And now, for example, in English, if you're supposed, rules of grammar, if you were noting the name of a book, it's supposed to be underlined, right? Well, it looks kind of clunky. But what's acceptable instead of underlining is to use the italic instead, and that you would use that as a substitute. So really, you only need one to pick from one type family to convey meaning, and then within that, in your design, you can pick. Depending on the typeface that you use, there are typically lots of variations. For the sans serif or the serif typefaces, there are fewer. You might be able to work in the italic and the bold, and maybe that's it. So it'll be for the Times, we were picked for the serif Times New Roman. You may only have 3 different families to choose, or 3 different variations of that family to choose from. That you have Times regular, italic, bold, and that might be it. Because most of the serif typefaces, particularly the older ones, are proportioned differently and don't lend themselves very well to the variations that you see. Okay, within each of these typefaces, let's see, each face within the family is when you look and it says font, this is what it means by the font. That for that particular typeface, the font are all the characters that apply to that particular typeface. So that means caps, lowercase, numerals, and special characters. It can be from an ampersand, which is the little and sign, to commas, to exclamation marks, whatever that's associated with that. This is what that. Okay, so that's what's applied to that. Okay, so that's what a font means. And that there's a lot of characters that go into developing a font. There's a lot that goes into designing typeface. So, okay, does everybody understand that? Font, because you see that all the time. It says font. You wonder what that means. So, think of the general categories, then within each category, you have a family of typefaces. For example, in sans serif, I picked Helvetica. And within that family, we have all of these typefaces, which are variations of it. And then within each face, you'll have an entire font that describes. These are the parts of letters. And it also, we'll talk about how type is measured. You'll see all the time points and hyphens and things like what do those mean, points and hyphens. So the line, when you start by, when you're typing a line of type, and you'll see underneath it in light blue a little line that runs across the base of it. Well, that is, in fact, called the baseline. And we saw that you can control where the type rides. It can be below the baseline, it can right on it, and it can be moved above the baseline in Photoshop or Illustrator. Okay. The line, the imaginary line that runs along the middle of these lowercase or smaller letters right along here is called the waistline. And any part of a letter that extends below the baseline is called the descender. Any part of the letter form that extends above the waistline is called the ascender. And when we're measuring type, and if I specify we don't have typesetters anymore, but if I specify that I want a specific X height that I'm looking for, that would be the distance from the baseline to the waistline. If I want to specify a specific cap height, if I'm designing an ad and I say I want all of my headlines to be at a cap height of 72 points, then that distance would be from the baseline to the top of the capital letter. And the next point leads to, and the last point I should say, leads to how type is measured. And you can see that when, in looking at these 5 different categories and 5 different type faces, you'll see that they all look like they're slightly different sizes. In fact, they're all the same size. They're all 36 point when I put this together. But the reason that they look different in size is how type is measured and how they're designed. How they're measured is that you start from the bottom of the D center and go to the top of the A center. So when you look at 72 point type, or you look at the copy, the default size might be 12 point. Where they're measuring that type is from the top of the A center and the bottom of the D center. And depending on how the type is designed, sometimes the A center can extend considerably above the top of the cap. And sometimes it can be short, or maybe it can extend way below the baseline. So that's the proportioning that will make the actual content of the type look larger or smaller, depending on the typeface you choose. Okay? Now that you understand the parts and you understand how type is measured, the units of type. So we'll start with the nomenclature. Type is measured in points and picas. The translation from points and picas to inches is pretty basic and pretty simple. There are 12 points to a pica. There are 6 picas to an inch. Therefore, there are 72 points to an inch. And as we said, if you're wondering, if I said I'm using 72 point type, well, what does that mean? It means that 72 points is measured from the bottom of the D center to the top of the A center. And as small a unit as a point is, it is visually detectable. I mean, you can tell the difference. If I'm using 7-point type or 8-point type, it sounds minuscule, but you can really see that difference. It's a significant difference. So going between 11-point or 12-point type can be, to a designer, can be really, really important. Somebody who's a type hound, maybe for their business cards, will want to use they typically want to, most designers want to be really minimal in the size that they use, and maybe they'll use 4-point or 5-point type, and they'll argue over whether they should use 4 or 5-point, and that's really the smallest that you want to get because it's unreadable. If it's anything smaller than that. And as I've said, type distance or type size is the distance from the top of the A center to the bottom of the E center. So this is how type is measured. And also ruled lines are also measured in points as well. So you'll see the default measurements for type. If I want a hairline or I want a standard size stroke, would be a 1-point rule. So that's 1/72 of an inch. And that's easier to think about in those terms and than to say that 1/72 of an inch is some fraction that I can't even think of. I mean, you could work in fractions, but it just doesn't make much sense. Okay. Capital letters are also talked about in terms of uppercase or UC. Some small letters are talked about in lowercase or LC. So when I talk about upper and lowercase, I'd like to work with a headline like nomenclature with an initial cap. That's some of the terminology that you use. Where the terms upper and lowercase came from is when type was set by hand. Actually, all the capital letters were in cases that were above, and those let ingots, and then the lowercase or small letters were in cases that were below. And that's where it came from. Kerning, there are great tools in Photoshop and Illustrator for adjusting. We covered that last week. Selectively adjusting the space between letters or words. That's what kerning is. Tracking is similar, but that's the uniform adjustment of space between letters and words. And then the distance or the space between lines of type is called leading. And again, that comes from traditional or old school. When type was hand set, they would actually, to increase the space between the lines of type, they would put little slivers of lead. And so that's where that term came. And it has stayed. Remains ever since. Typically, if you, and something I didn't put in here, but when we talk about leading, if the type is set solid, then that would mean, for example, if we were using 12-point type, it would be 12 on 12. And that would mean there would be no additional leading, no additional spacing between lines. So that would mean that the bottom of the descender from the top line would almost touch the top of the ascender from the line beneath it. Okay, that's how they're matched. Okay, and if I wanted additional space between lines, and if you use the default setting, it's a little over, typically, I forget what percentage that they use, but oftentimes if you're going to use 12-point type, it would be like 12 on 13, which means that you're using 12-point type, and the spacing is, you have 1 point of leading between those two lines. When you're designing for magazines, ads, whatever it is, type is typically broken down into just 3 basic sizes. You have your headline, your subheads, and then you have your copy, your body copy, whatever you want to call it. Now, this is where we run into, I'm talking about very general, and that there are lots of, many times when the rules will be broken and it won't follow under these specific sizes. But for headline, subheads, and copy, when you're working on 8.5 by 11 letter-sized paper or tabloid-sized paper, these are the general rules that will go by in terms of the sizes that you would use for the type. Copy typically starts at around 8-point and goes up to 13. And 13-point is large. That's like the Reader's Digest, or people like myself who can't see real well. The big type. 13-point is large. Column widths for a copy start at around 13.5 to 13.6 picas. And if you're using 2 columns, or you want a double column of type, it shouldn't probably be any wider than 48 picas. If it's any longer than this, it's really much too hard for the reader to track from one line to the next. In fact, this would be an exception, 48. We really don't have rulers anymore, do we? I probably have one floating around that has points and picas on it where you can actually measure. But if you were to look at the columns in the LA Times or the New York Times or stuff, most of those columns you see they're broken down into about 8 columns, measuring about 13.5. Each of these columns right here typically measure around 13.5 picas. Subheads start anywhere from 14 to 18 point, but again, depending on what you're designing, this could really, all of these can change dramatically. And then the headlines can start from 24 point and go up to as big as they need to be. Now, when we're talking posters, you probably aren't going to measure the type in points. You're probably going to measure it in picas or even in inches when you're talking about, large posters, large. Okay. I think that's it. That's all I wanted to cover, just the basics. Okay. Is there anything in Photoshop in the use of the type tool that you want me to review? Because there's wonderful tools for controlling all of these elements, for really messing type up, in fact. Remember, we can control the heights and the widths actually took the typeface and we make a condensed typeface from it or extend it. It's not a good idea to do that, but there are tools inside Photoshop that allow you to do that. Does that give you some idea of this type basics? Okay, that's it for today. Anybody, if you want to print or set up to print, you can work on finishing your